If you've watched the video on premises, then you know that a premise is a reason that we make a conclusion. There's a special class of problems where we have a premise, but we also have what's called a suppressed premise, or a premise that's suggested but not expressly stated. So in this case, if your boss says, look, all of our employees have to have good hygiene, so you're fired. Well, what is your boss implying about your hygiene? He's suggesting that it's not good. But do you notice how he said you have bad hygiene by hinting at it? He didn't actually say your hygiene is bad. That's a suppressed premise. In formal logic, we say, if A, then B, if B, then C, therefore we can conclude if A, then C. That's a good, sound argument. A suppressed premise is when you take out that middle line. You take out the if B then C and you go straight from if A then B all the way down to if A then C. And the if B then C part, that's implied, the same way that we implied that your hygiene was bad in the previous example. You can usually identify a suppressed premise by first identifying the conclusion, and then asking yourself, why do they think that? And then why do they think that? By working your way backwards, the suppressed premise is often easier to identify. So in this case, the conclusion is a drug test is unconstitutional. And then why do they think that? Well, any action that intrudes on the right of privacy, that action is then unconstitutional. So we made a jump from intruding on the right of privacy down to a drug test in our conclusion. So that's our suppressed premise, that a drug test intrudes on the right of privacy. Let's try that again. Our first job is to identify the conclusion. We know from watching our conclusion video that if we have a reason indicator, such as the word since, the conclusion is usually on the opposite end of that sentence. So in this case, the conclusion is at the end of the sentence, which is some books by Garden Path are flawed. And then we can ask, well, why do they think they're flawed? In the sentence above, we see a book is flawed if it doesn't contain the basics of composting. And then why do they think that? Why do they think that the books don't contain the basics? Well, in the sentence above that, it says it doesn't contain the difference between hot and cold composting. So, are hot and cold composting, are those basics? The correct answer is we don't know. That's what the argument is implying. If you wanted to support or strengthen the argument, you would reinforce the idea that hot and cold composting are basics. If you wanted to weaken the argument, you would point out that hot and cold composting are not basics. Here's another one of my favorites. We start off by finding the conclusion. We have our since, that's our premise, and since our premise, he has a felony conviction, that's at the end of our sentence, that means our conclusion must be at the beginning of the sentence, which is Murray cannot be accepted to the position of executive administrator. And then why do they think he can't be accepted to the position of executive administrator? Well, because no one with a felony conviction can be appointed to the board. Now here's something critically important to notice. Do you see how executive administrator only appears in the conclusion? That's a big red flag for a suppressed premise. The rule is, if you want to mention an idea in the conclusion, you have to bring it up in the reasoning. And they almost do. They want you to at least to think they do, because they do mention the executive board, which has the word executive in it, so it sounds like the word executive administrator. So they're definitely implying that the executive board is somehow connected to the executive administrator. But they don't say it out loud. They don't expressly state it. They simply imply it. So that's your suppressed premise, that somehow the executive administrator is on the executive board. Let's do one more. Again, our first step is to identify the conclusion. This time they've made it easy. They gave us a conclusion indicator with the word so. Then that sentence talks about what's necessary, which is a strong opinion word. So we now know our conclusion is high-risk individuals should receive a vaccine for a different strain of the virus. And if you read the passage carefully, there's one word in the conclusion that is not in the reasoning. And so often that's what you're doing. You're trying to make sure that the reasoning supports the conclusion. If you want to pause and find it yourself, I'll give you a second to do that. If not, I'm going to tell you what it is. It's the word different. Do you see how different isn't anywhere else in the passage? We talk about high-risk individuals. That's in the passage. So we have it in the conclusion and in the reasoning. The word virus is in the conclusion and the reasoning. Vaccinations are as well, but different is not. All we talk about is going after the virus that is the most prevalent. So we make a jump from being prevalent to being different. And once again, that's our suppressed premise. If you wanted to reinforce or strengthen the argument, you would say that every year the prevalent virus is different from what it was last year. If you wanted to weaken the argument, you would say that the prevalent virus is not different, or it's the same as it was last year. Remember, if you're going to bring up an idea in the conclusion, you absolutely must bring it up in the reasoning.